As mentioned in the previous video, there are two main types of virtual machine, those running directly on hardware and those running inside what's called a host operating system. We're not going to discuss the virtual machines running on hardware, as mentioned, because it's not particularly possible within web development circles, which is why I'm interested in virtualization in the first place. So on to virtual machines running on software. Probably the most popular piece of software used for virtual machines is called VirtualBox, and that's what we're going to look at today. But plenty of others do exist, so just be aware of that. To install VirtualBox, you simply need to go to virtualbox.org and click the big download button. And once that's installed, you will see a screen appear something like this, although this section and this section will both be blank. So you can see here, for example, that I've created a machine already called Ubuntu, which is currently powered off. To create a new machine yourself, you're first going to need an operating system. And so if we head over to ubuntu.com, we'll be able to download the latest version of Ubuntu. If you want to use any other operating system you can think of, you're free to do so. Many people, for example, would rather install Fedora or Gentoo or Arch Linux, while some other people may use VirtualBox to install other copies of Windows, although you would need licensing to do that. So let's download Ubuntu. We're just going to download the desktop version, and we'll download the latest version here. Once that's finished downloading, we can go ahead and create our new virtual machine. So click the New button in the top left. We're going to call this Ubuntu Demo. We're going to specify that it's going to be Linux, and we're going to install Ubuntu. And now we can just click Next. We're going to need to assign some memory for our computer to use, and so I would typically give it a couple of gigabytes. We can change this later on if we need to, but it's always best to start off with more memory and more hard drive that we're going to need, and then take it away if we actually need to. So next, we need to set up the hard drive. It's unlikely, if this is your first installation, that you would have an existing virtual drive, so just click Create New Virtual Hard Disk now, and click Create. For what we're doing, it doesn't really matter which type of hard drive we're using, and so we can just leave it as VDI, and click Next. So next up, we're asked whether we want to dynamically allocate space to our hard drive, or give it a fixed size up front. There's no real point in giving the system a fixed size if we don't need to, especially because we're going to be using this for development, and so the size can change. So we'll just leave this as dynamically allocated and click Next. We do, however, need to give it a file name and a rough size as to what we should expect it to be, even though we can reallocate this later on. So the easiest thing to do is to assign it a size that you will be comfortable losing on your hard drive if you need to, but not too small. Remember that you're not going to lose this space immediately, but adding space later on does mean an additional step. So finally we click Create. As you can see, the virtual machine itself is created and it's currently powered off. So at this point, this is the equivalent of having all of the parts for the server built and constructed, but not having installed Ubuntu or anything else on it yet. So before we actually go ahead and start up Ubuntu, we're going to need to adjust some settings. So with the server selected, click on Settings. Feel free to browse through and change any of these settings yourself. For example, if you do want to change the amount of memory allocated, you can do so here. One of the few settings that we're going to change is the video memory, and I'm just going to up that to 64 megabytes. Just so that we have a more fluid experience when we're actually using the server. Next up, we need to go into Network. In here we have different options about how we're actually going to connect to the network. So NAT, for example, uses your host machine as an access terminal, whereas Bridged uses your network card directly and connects directly to your local network. If you're using virtual machines to explore different network topologies, you may find these different options useful, but for now we're just going to leave this as NAT. I'm also just going to select this advanced drop down here, and I'm just going to point out the port forwarding feature. If you're going to be running a web server on your virtual machine, and you want to access it from your host machine. So in this example, if I installed Ubuntu and Apache onto Ubuntu, I would still want to be able to access the web server from within Windows. To do this, you just need to create a new rule and specify which IP we're going to forward. So in this case, we would forward port 8080 to port 80. So from Windows, I would be able to type localhost 8080 and access port 80 within the virtual machine. The final point I want to mention within the settings is shared folders. If you're going to want to access your files from your Windows machine on your Linux machine, you can do that very easily by adding a shared folder in here. So in this example, I've created a new folder within Windows called Devirtualization, which is going to be accessed within our virtual machine. We can also make this read-only if we want to, and auto-mount it, which we're going to do, and click OK to add that. So now that we've set up our basic settings, we can go ahead and install Ubuntu. Before we go back and start up the server, there's one final step to do, which is to effectively add in a CD, so that we can go ahead and install Ubuntu from a CD. To do this, we need to click on Storage and select the CD drive. On the right here, we're going to select this CD icon and navigate to our Ubuntu installation download. So as you can see, I've now added D downloads Ubuntu desktop, which is our CD which is going to run when we first start up the system. So now we can click OK and start the system. When it loads up, we're going to be able to access the Ubuntu installer, and so we can just click Install Ubuntu. This is going to take us through the installation process, so we can just go ahead and download all of the relevant things as we go along. If you want to enable any of these settings as we progress, you can do. For example, you can enable encryption, but for now we're just going to click Install Now. Because this is a new installation, we're going to be given this message telling us that we're going to overwrite the changes to the disk. This is all fine because we're overwriting effectively a blank hard drive, and so we're effectively just formatting it, and so we can just click Continue. We're going to be given a couple of customization settings, most of which we can just click directly through. If you want to change your computer's name or anything else, you can do so here. And then the installation process itself is going to begin. This process can take quite a while, so I'm just going to speed up the video and come back to you when we've installed Ubuntu completely. As you can see, the installation process is now complete, and we're presented with this message asking us to restart the machine. Before we do this, however, we need to remove the disk from the drive. Otherwise, we're just going to restart into the installation screen again. And so if we click on Devices, Optical Drives, and Remove Disk from Virtual Drive, we're going to be given this message saying that it's currently in use. And so we can just click Force on Mount. And now we can click Restart Now. The machine will then restart, and because we don't have a disk in the drive, we will boot directly into Ubuntu. So I'm just going to log in. And here we have our fresh install of Ubuntu on VirtualBox. There is, however, one more step that we should consider before we're done with this installation. If we try to resize this screen, we're going to notice that the actual window itself doesn't resize. This is not too much of a problem, but it is something that we can do something about. If we look through the options, we'll be able to find this Insert Guest Editions CD image. Guest Editions is a way that we can install options called VirtualBox Editions, which makes our Ubuntu installation work more fluidly with VirtualBox. And so we can just run this. It's going to ask us for our password, which we can add in, and it's going to install the relevant packages. Again, this part of the process may take a few moments, and so I'm going to speed this up again. And as we can see, this is installed correctly, and so we can just click Return to close that window. Now if we restart our virtual machine again, so we'll just shut down this VirtualBox installation and start it back up. This time, if we resize our screen, we'll see that the actual desktop of Ubuntu resizes with it. This means that we can actually have a full screen view if we really want to, depending on the task that we're actually performing. Now just before we end this video, there is just one more demonstration, which is the fact that we can access the shared folder that we created earlier. So if we start a new terminal session, we can change ourselves to the root user by doing sudo-i and typing the password. And if we now navigate to media, we'll be able to see a folder called, in our case, SF Virtualization, which we can obviously move into. Now this is the exact same folder on our hard drive as we created earlier. So if we create a new file here called example.txt, we can then go ahead and open this file in Windows Explorer. So as you can see here, example.txt has been created, and this file is obviously within Windows. We can add some text to it here. And then if we want to open it in Linux, we can use nano to open it. And we can see the text that we've just added in Windows. Now this is obviously a very simple example, but you could of course use this to save all of your website on your main machine and only access it through the virtual machine. If this is a file that you're going to be using very frequently, I would suggest adding your main user to the group VBoxSF, rather than having to use root to access this folder every single time. So just to summarise, we've created a virtual machine in this video, and with VirtualBox you can create as many virtual machines as you want. You saw for example that right now I currently have 2 virtual machines installed. The only limitation as to how many you have is the size of your hard drive. Depending on your hardware, you can probably have multiple virtual machines running at the same time as well. So you could have a virtual machine for your web server and a separate virtual machine for your database server, or any other combination that you can think of. There are also no real limitations as to which operating systems you install. I've installed Ubuntu in this case, but as mentioned you could easily install Fedora or Red Hat or any other Linux distribution. If you are interested in networking, you may be particularly interested in installing pfSense for example, to examine how a router works. And because everything is virtual, you can play around with all of these different servers or different operating systems and experiment with different configurations and different systems without worrying about the hardware which is underlying the actual operation. Most importantly, have fun when you're playing around with VirtualBox. The disposable nature of virtual machines means that many of the limitations of playing around with an operating system are removed. If you were playing around with a Windows virtual machine and you happened to delete the entire registry, there's no real problem. Just delete that copy and install a clean copy. In the next video we're going to be looking at containers, which we mentioned in the previous video. Containers are very similar to the concept of virtual machines, but they're much lighter weight, and because they're much lighter weight, they are much more flexible. So stay tuned for that. What do you think of this video? Has it been helpful? Have you learned something new? Let me know in the comments, hit that subscribe button and check out some of these other videos.